Thank you very much for meeting with us today. And before we get started on our discussion about social impact bonds and the Rockefeller Foundation's view of that model in the market, I thought maybe you could just tell us and our viewers a little bit about your role here at the Foundation.
Sure. I'm a managing director at the Foundation, and I work on the program side of the Foundation. In our new initiative model, we don't have set long-term programs. Instead, we work on short-term initiatives where we see an opportunity to work with some momentum, some potential change, system change that can occur, where a short-term intervention of 5 to 7 years by the Foundation with its partners can potentially create catalytic change in a sector. We work across geographies, we work across sectors. Ultimately, we look for opportunities where our role can be catalytic in creating change. And certainly, for us, the work of social impact bonds is a good example where there's a lot of momentum in the field, but there's also a need for a thoughtful and deliberative intervention by the collaboration of people, and that's something that we're hoping to support.
So can you talk to us a little bit then about why social impact bond is a compelling pursuit that fits in with this initiative?
Sure. For the Rockefeller Foundation, the social impact bonds are very much aligned with two initiatives we have at the Foundation that have been in existence for a few years. These touch on really the two elements of the social impact bond that I think we'll talk more about. One is the social impact bond as an exciting, promising tool of innovation. And the other is the social impact bond as a potential way to mobilize for-profit investment capital to address social change. At the Rockefeller Foundation, the two initiatives tied to those themes are an initiative we have on innovation, where we don't work on product innovation, asking the question, how can we make better things? Instead, we help to support process innovation, the challenge of how do we solve social problems in a more effective way. And certainly the social impact bonds are one example of a few areas where we are working with both nonprofits and government to bring process innovation to bear on the social challenges we face. On the other initiative that we're working on is something we call harnessing the power of impact investing. And impact investors are a gathering force of investors around the world who seek to put for-profit capital to work to address social challenges. And for this group, the social impact bond is a potentially very exciting and powerful tool that can take the intention of an investor who wants to address a social problem, but in a way that generates financial return, and allow them to do that through the social impact bond. So for us, the social impact bonds are very much tied to two different initiatives. We work collaboratively across those two teams to support social impact bonds in various ways.
And as you know, in addition to the social impact bond, there's a number of other models or other ideas around what you just described around innovation and sort of the leveraging of private capital. How do you see those sort of fitting into the support, shall we say, of social impact bond and of the initiatives that you're talking about?
Sure. I think in general, we don't focus just on social impact bonds, as you pointed out.
Okay.
For us, it's identifying ways that process innovation can be infused throughout government, especially the latest iteration of that work has been focused on public sector innovation. We work with the Department of Education, looking at how they've applied crowdsourcing models of process innovation in some of the challenge grants processes they put together recently. And on the impact investing side, we have a range of initiatives, not only focused on new mechanisms for investors, such as the social impact bond, but also focused on the other pieces of the ecosystem that are going to be necessary to enable for-profit investors to address social change effectively. Those include work we are doing to support collaboration among impact investors through organizations like the Global Impact Investing Network. We also believe very strongly that if we are going to separate out the impact investors from the impact imposters, those people who want to claim they're creating social good but actually are just doing it as window dressing, we need standards for measuring social impact. We need credible ratings agencies and other pieces of infrastructure that can allow the impact investing industry to sit alongside philanthropy and government as a powerful force for addressing social challenges. And so our work in impact investing it ranges from supporting collaboration, supporting those core pieces of infrastructure, and also developing the social impact bond and other mechanisms of intermediation, those tools and processes and institutions that can take impact investing capital and turn it into both profit and social outcomes.
I like the term of impact imposter very much. I have to also just pause and congratulate you because I understand there's a book coming out soon. If you're, as yourself
Sure.
as
Do you
the
want
author.
to plug that in the video?
Yeah, absolutely. So
and social impact bonds we actually feature in the book.
You
as
do?
an example,
Okay,
we have a
that was
chapter in the book. Yeah, we're looking at the future of impact investing and what will take it to the next level. We see social impact bonds as a very powerful tool because unlike where the impact investor industry has been, which is applying existing processes to new targets, impact investors have historically used private equity funds, they've used loans funds, they've used mezzanine finance structures. These are the tools that have long existed and served the for-profit capital markets, and impact investors have learned and developed ways to apply those to companies and products and financial structures that can also support social outcomes. What's very exciting about the social impact bond is it's not simply taking an existing process and turning it to social issues. Instead, it's a fundamentally new way of organizing investors, governments, service providers, and the communities who need service in a new structure that we think is the kind of innovation that's going to be necessary for the impact investing industry to realize its promise to complement government and philanthropy in addressing social problems.
So can we go back to that ecosystem then, as you describe it, and talk a little bit more about what is necessary for all sides, for all players in that ecosystem to be able to succeed in these new models?
Sure.
I think there's been a lot of conversation on the investor side, but we're just starting to talk with local governments, state governments, and also the equally important nonprofit provider
Sure.
as part of the ecosystem.
You know, one of the things we've learned about innovation and social innovation specifically is that when it is most successful, it often is about combining the interests and the perspectives of people who are unused to working together. And at its core, the social impact bond is a very powerful tool because it does unite the investors, the providers, the governments, and the recipients of service in a new way. That's the power of the tool. It's also a challenge. These are not institutions or people who are typically used to working together, and therefore we cannot expect that simply by announcing our excitement about a tool or pursuing a few pilot projects, we're going to create the broader ecosystem that can enable those kinds of people to work together more effectively. And so our work for the social impact bonds, we think that this idea is exciting enough, and we know that certainly the work that the NFF and other partners are doing will ensure that there will be a few pilot projects in the next few months and years. There's already a pilot going on in the UK, as you know. There are advanced steps toward setting up pilot projects in the US. We're not concerned that the pilots, that those seeds of innovation will get planted. What is a challenge is to ensure that the soil in which those seeds gets planted is fertile. And I think when we talk about the ecosystem, we really think about it as that fertile soil that's going to enable those seeds to grow not only into individual pilot projects, but a broader systemic change that the social impact bond has the potential, if it is applied in the right ecosystem, to create. For us at the Rockefeller Foundation, we have honed down our understanding of that ecosystem and what our role could be in it into three areas. We believe that there are intermediaries who need to be supported, organizations that will structure social impact bonds and be the glue that connects those various constituencies unused to working together. We are looking to work with others to support some of those intermediaries, some who have come up and have been born out of an interest in creating that social impact bond marketplace specifically, others that are already working in various aspects of this work on the innovation side or the social service side, but who could potentially step up and play that role of intermediation. So the first piece of an ecosystem that will be necessary to create that fertile soil is a strong group of well-resourced and effective intermediaries who can structure these bonds. The second piece of the work, and this is the work that the Nonprofit Finance Fund is leading, is creating the hub that can ensure that the learnings that occur in one pilot are quickly transferred across the community. Again, we are not worried that individual pilots will take off, but we want to ensure that when those pilots do take off, the learnings we create, not only in their outcomes, but also in the process of getting them done, are learnings that can quickly be disseminated across all the various players in the space who need to understand what is both the power of this tool and also its limitations. Because there is a challenge that without effective coordination and connection, the hype might outrun the reality of what is possible. So the first piece of work is to make sure there are strong and effective intermediaries. The second is to ensure that there is a hub and a coordination that enables these new players to work together and enables the learnings that we generate from one experiment to quickly be disseminated throughout the community so that we don't make new mistakes, and that, in the words of Tom Peters, we fail forward when we fail, which is an important aspect of the innovation process. The third piece of the ecosystem is going to be working with local governments and with the providers to ensure that they have the capabilities, again, to understand what this tool can be, to understand what it should not try and be, and to work effectively with investors and with those intermediaries and with the service providers to pursue the next generation of social impact bonds. Again, for us, this comes out of innovation work. We've learned a lot, not just at the Rockefeller Foundation, but in general, the field of social innovation has developed some important learnings in the last decade about how we take innovation and ensure that it is replicated and goes from an exciting pilot to really realizing its potential for systemic change. And for us, that's the theme. We're supporting. We also believe that while social impact bonds in many aspects can generate earned revenue for providers, whether they're nonprofits or for-profits, that there are components of that ecosystem that will by necessity need to be subsidized. We're not shy about that. We think it's important to understand where public goods are going to be important so that people can focus on building the ecosystem and not just on launching individual projects. And so for us as a foundation, while we invested using our PRI dollars into the social impact bond in the UK, we're also using grant money to help provide those subsidies and look forward to working with a range of other funders, both the private foundations as well as city and local governments, not only to get some pilots launched, but also to build that broader ecosystem, the intermediaries, the ability to network and coordinate, and the ability to help support local state governments and the providers to take advantage of this new tool.
When we think about the pilots that may launch, and I think you're right, I think we're likely to see a number of them, and they will likely look different one to the next across the country. There's been a lot of discussion on blogs and in the press and behind closed doors about the concern of the early pilots not going well, and perhaps therefore setting up the market to rule out this particular model of a social impact bond or others like it. But on the other hand, the nature of the U.S. is that innovation is diffuse, is at the grassroots and local level, and we are likely to have a real variety of pilots, and we are likely to have some failure along the way or some missteps that we can hopefully learn from. How do you think we harness that, and do you think there's a real risk there?
Sure, I think you're absolutely right. In innovation, failure will occur. The challenge is to ensure that when the failure occurs, we fail forward, and we don't see failure or we don't allow failure of one model to be seen as a failure of the entire concept. And I also think it's very important to think of failure not in binary terms. It's not just that some social impact bonds might not work, and therefore it will fail. I think some social impact bonds might not work, but if they're innovative, pushing the idea, and are clearly articulated to their supporters as such from the beginning, then that not need be a failure that necessarily preempts the development of the broader impact bond idea. So one way in which we could fail without failing is if we ensure that when we are taking a risk and really pushing the model, we're doing so in areas where we're being very clear about it, and we're bringing into those social impact bonds the kind of funders who understand that that's what they're getting into. I think the other important point about this issue of failure is we could also have a failure that looks like a success. And by that I mean we could not aim as high. We could create some social impact bonds that simply put together the funding sources and the social service providers and the governments in a way that are simple and easy and are the low-hanging fruit, but that lead us down a dead end, where while it looks successful, and it is for the terms of that pilot, it does not create the entry ramp for that pilot to lead to a much broader road in which others can take off. And so I think failure, we need to be nuanced about what we mean by that. And to be very clear on the last point, a lot of different ideas are now coming under the rhetorical umbrella of social impact bond. And so again, the point of failure is one idea that might be successful for the proponent that has a more narrow view of what this is could be a failure for those who actually want the social impact bond to be much more broader and generate much more systemic change. And so there's a way in which we could fail by only piloting the easiest and most narrow view of this model, which will look successful to the people for whom that's what they're aiming to achieve, but would be a failure for those who want this to be more systemic. That's a little bit abstract. Just to be a little bit clear about, I think, two specific ways in which the model really represents a different set of ambitions, has a different set of supporters, and therefore could potentially succeed in one way, but not in a way that leads to the broader view. And I think that's where we seen, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of writing and talking about whether the social impact bond is really a tool to fund innovation in a new way, or whether it's a tool to engage the capital markets and those impact investors I mentioned at the beginning. I think social impact bonds could be incredibly powerful if they simply enable local governments and others to find a new way to pilot in a small scale the kinds of innovations and preventative services that otherwise would not get funded through city governments. That would be incredibly exciting, and that would be a powerful spur to those of us who believe that there is substantial value to be gained by society from seeing innovative solutions piloted and taken to scale. In that model, because the focus of the bond would be on innovation, it is going to be much harder to engage the capital markets, who, by the nature of what investors seek, are more wary of risk. And so, for a social impact bond focused on funding innovation, which is an imperative for governments that are seeing those kinds of budgets cut, we could imagine a set of bonds being created in which the ultimate funders are private foundations, who at their best are really the innovation capital in our social capital markets. They could be struck as deals between governments and private foundations, where the private foundations agree to pay for a social impact bond where outcomes are realized. And in that case, they would be able to fund innovation. They would be able to fund new ideas, because philanthropists, in many cases, you'd be able to find some who would be willing to back ideas that might not work. And so if that's what social impact bonds are, they could be very exciting. They could be a new way to organize philanthropic spending and to coordinate between local governments and foundations. What that model would be unlikely to produce, if it only stays in that more constrained way, is a bridge toward engaging the for-profit capital markets. So on the other hand are a set of social impact bonds which see as their ultimate goal not just reorganizing how we fund innovation with private foundations, but ultimately opening up a much broader capital markets to the funding of social solutions. For that to happen, we're going to need pilots that don't fail, but also that are not as ambitious in terms of funding innovation. Because, as I mentioned, investors by their nature are already going to be seeing social impact bonds as a highly speculative and risky tool. They're not then going to want to add onto that the risk of funding social impact bonds that are supporting innovations that are untested. And so for the social impact bonds that are really going to build the bridges to the capital markets, we need to be identifying social impact bonds that draw on already proven interventions, where what we're asking the investors to take on is the risk of the social impact bond model and not necessarily the risk of the intervention itself. To many people, that's less exciting, because that doesn't allow us to fund those exciting new unproven ideas that we all want to see tested. Neither model is right or wrong, and I think, to be absolutely honest with you, our own thinking on this has evolved. As you mentioned, the sort of polyglot and exciting nature of innovation of this idea in America, especially, has led us to realize that both models could be very powerful. And we're not sitting here and saying we should pursue one, or that pursuing one is necessarily going to be in conflict with the other. We believe both models are actually quite powerful. What we realize, though, is we, as a community who want to see this concept realize its potential, have to be very clear about what it is we're funding and what funding sources and what funding types match what ambitions. It would be inappropriate to set up a social impact bond focused on innovation and seek to tap the mainstream capital markets. And so it's not that one is right or wrong. We believe both can be powerful. I know that some people believe that they might be in conflict, and that there's a competition or a race to demonstrate the social impact bond in one or the other model. We actually think that this whole ecosystem should be diverse and will be, but it's going to require great clarity. It's going to require coordination. And in addition to the three pieces of the ecosystem I mentioned, the intermediation, the coordination among the providers, and the support to governments, we also need some just good, effective research about not just the specific applications of this tool, but what this tool itself more broadly can be. And we need that research not only to be analytically rigorous, but also to be communicated effectively. Not something that sits just in policy shops or in academic houses, but something that really engages the broader community who could be excited about one or both of those models in a very honest discussion about what it is we're trying to do and who are going to have to line up behind those ambitions.
And I would think that if you were to pursue both paths, and I actually think they're reinforcing, that you would be able to build excitement, but that excitement would then demand a pipeline of some sort. And so the idea of engaging community at local levels and being able to convey the ideas to those who would ultimately have to implement on this model seems to be a very important piece to this. And I just wonder what your thinking is about how to continue to educate and build the community piece of this equation.
Sure, I think that there is some very honest and realistic skepticism among providers, and there's a real worry that some of the hype around social impact bonds is going to distract governments and foundations from funding basic social services in the way that they have been in the past. So I think before we can get people excited, I think we also need to be very clear about engaging with some of the worry that people legitimately have about this tool. Part of that worry is about the hype. And I think when we hear some people talk about how social impact bonds can transform the great bulk of government spending, service providers and people in the communities are legitimately worried about what that means about the systems that are working. And I think it's important, certainly as the Rockefeller Foundation, we believe that while social impact bonds are incredibly powerful, they are not going to replace government spending, that the vast majority of what governments and private foundations fund should continue to be funded through mechanisms that already exist that have proven successful. And so, first of all, we need to just be very clear about what we're talking about. We're talking about a potentially powerful tool that could transform millions of people's lives. We're not talking about something that's going to upend everything. And I think we just have to be quite clear, and in the UK especially, where this has been coupled to a very visible political agenda at the national government level, and a real disruption to the funding flows of social service provision in that country. Sometimes the hype around social impact bonds, which excites those of us who understand the concept, can also legitimately be very worrying to those who rely on a different funding flow currently. So we need to be clear about what it is we're talking about. It's an exciting innovation. It should really create new opportunities for the effective service providers in certain locations addressing certain problems with certain tools to actually get more funding. It shouldn't be seen as something that's going to take good service providers who are currently creating good work and take away or pull the rug from under them. So I think first of all, we also, we need to be realistic. Certainly the Rockefeller Foundation, through our Impact Investing Initiative, we are absolutely convinced that for-profit investors have a moral legitimacy in engaging on solving social problems. Most people don't believe that. And after the financial crisis, we are absolutely understanding why many people in the social service sector see the idea of financial structuring as something that's quite worrisome. And they challenge the moral legitimacy of those people who say that investors and investment bankers have a right to sit alongside us in the noble work of solving social issues. And so again, I think we just have a communication challenge. We also not just need to communicate more effectively, also need to legitimately be sitting down with people and being much more thoughtful about how we bring people into this process. This is not going to be something that will succeed if it's investors sitting in back rooms with local governments cooking up deals that then get handed down and change how funding flows work for the nonprofits. This has to be something that deeply engages the service providers. At the end of the day, when it is effective, a social impact bond actually has the power to do that as powerfully as anything else because it aligns the interests of those investors concretely with the service providers. There are a few other mechanisms which would ultimately lead to an investor having a deep and abiding not only interest in, but incentive to ensure that a nonprofit does its work very, very well. And so while that's intimidating and foreboding to some, we actually think if done well, that could be incredibly exciting and really create that transformative innovation I talked about at the beginning, which is going to come from people unused to working together, collaborating, and therefore bringing new ideas and new skills to bear on existing problems.
One thing we've not touched on is the role of the federal government in this effort. And you referenced the UK pilot and its very tight connection actually to a national political agenda. And how do you see the pay for success projects of the Obama budget impacting this overall effort and beyond perhaps just the model of the social impact?
Sure. Well, I think first of all, what it does is galvanize attention. When President Obama proposed that $100 million pay for success mandate in the 2012 budget, suddenly we started receiving more calls. And so did you and many others. And so, if nothing else, the simple description of this in the budget immediately galvanizes attention. I think in the medium term, it is also going to enable the pilot project to be scaled up more efficiently. again, I think we need to be clear. There's enough momentum behind this idea that even absent the federal government mandate, some pilots would have been launched anyway and will be launched in the next few months. The federal mandate is not necessary for that. What it is necessary, it is one piece of that fertile soil in which those initial pilots will be planted. Because if they succeed, or if they create momentum and those pilots demonstrate to others the potential of this idea, what the federal mandate does is make it much easier for local and state governments to follow on. So we don't think that the mandate was necessary to get this momentum going. It is going to be crucial to ensure that the first phase of pilots translates quickly into the rollout in a broader way. And so I think that's where the money itself will make a difference. And beyond the money, it's that mandate from the federal government that effectively says to local and state governments, here is some bureaucratic cover to ensure that you can move more quickly than you otherwise might have in adopting this innovation. Certainly your point about the difference between work in the US and the UK is something that we've noticed through this work, and I think it's quite obvious to people who work as deeply as you and others do in the US government, and that is both the genius and at the times frustration of our system is its decentralized and polyglot nature. In the UK, the Justice Ministry was able to sign a social impact bond contract with a single intermediary, social finance, to produce the $8 million pilot. In the US, when we talk to people who work on issues of recidivism and justice, it's almost laughable, the idea that we could find one person in Washington who could underwrite that contract because of the decentralized nature of our justice system and the role that local and state governments play. Again, I think that creates much more opportunities to find the right people and to work with people who are innovating. It also creates greater complexity. And one of the challenges in seeing the social impact bond tool realized is that while there are many examples and many places and issues where a social impact bond could theoretically create both savings for the local government and effective social outcomes, which is the engine that fuels, or the fuel that runs any social impact bond, is going to need to find an example where prevention costs less than treatment, where those savings can then be shared between the investors and the local governments, and that is really the fuel of the social impact bond. One of the challenges in a system as decentralized and complicated as ours is, in many cases, where we can create savings, those savings might not accrue to a single entity, a single agency, and therefore finding the logical counterparty for the social service providers and the investors to work with in government is more difficult. Because even if we're able to generate millions and millions of dollars of savings, those savings might fall onto the books of two different local agencies. They might come with some state money that's now being saved, and there might be some federal money as well. And it creates a more complicated environment to work. I think, again, that's why we need to be very realistic about understanding not only where this tool could be effective, but also being very realistic in understanding where it will not be. Not only because the social issue might not be appropriate for this kind of funding, but also because the nature of how that social service and how the treatment programs are funded might make it too complicated for investors, at least in this beginning phase, to make these pilots work.
I think we've definitely highlighted through this conversation the complexities of not just this model, but of what it offers us across the sector in terms of sort of changing our orientation. And I think it's actually quite exciting, that there's a lot of opportunity here. But maybe one last question. You've talked earlier about the foundation evolving its thinking on this topic. Do you have a definition of success for the work, or will it continue to evolve?
I think it's too early in an innovation process like this to say that we can lay down very specific, quantifiable outcomes about the number of bonds or the number of social issues that we want to see in place. I think for us, success is about the innovation process moving forward in a way that opens up as many possibilities as possible, and that is also quite realistic about articulating and understanding what this tool can achieve and what it can't achieve. So for us, success wouldn't be X number of bonds in X number of localities by a certain date, but rather that this process has done three things. One, that we've allowed through this process to create the collaboration and the process of collaboration that allows the various players to work together in ways that they haven't. That's where we talked about the work that the Nonprofit Finance Fund is doing in coordinating, and others as well. So for us, the innovation process will need to be one that really does allow us to engage many constituencies. And again, not just take the people who are most inclined to work with us and sort of create a cycle bubble where we all believe that we've convinced ourselves that these pilots are on their way to much broader systemic change, but really ask ourselves what it's going to take to create the groundwork for that systemic change. I think that's one. The second is to really underscore the point that to move from simply successful pilots to a more systemic change is going to require subsidies, and it's going to require a coalition of people working together who see in this tool a real public good and understand where private capital is appropriate, but also where the public capital is necessary as well. And then the third point, and this links to the two different visions for the social impact bond, is how do we ensure that our pursuit of short-term success defined by the launch of pilots that work on their own terms also creates the conditions by which we can build the bridges toward the more systemic change as well. And so I think that's another aspect of success. We'll be monitoring over the next few years how we're working toward those broader possibilities. And that's almost more important than necessarily that X number of pilots in the short term succeed. It's understanding what it's going to take to walk not down a dead end, but really onto an entry ramp for something that's much more broader and more powerful.
Are there any other questions that you would have wanted to be asked, or things that you think should be raised at this time?
I think I'm good.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I mean, this has been an exciting work for Nonprofit Finance Fund to do along with you, and we appreciate your vision on it.
Great. Well, we appreciate your hard work, and I look forward to continuing this journey together.
Great. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.